Welcome to Let's Talk Democracy, the show where we have meaningful conversations on democracy. I'm your host, Tina Johnson. And each week, we're joined by people who are doing the hard work of building healthy democratic environments. With insightful guests, expert advice, and thought-provoking conversations, we dive deep into the heart of democracy. Whether you're here to learn or to get inspired, we've got something for you. Let's jump in and explore today's episode. One of the conversations I have found myself engaged in lately has been around whether or not the U.S. elections will even happen in 2026 or 2028. We've heard it from other guests. There's a question of whether or not elections in the U.S. will be allowed to go on. So today we're diving into one of the most urgent and essential issues, perhaps of our time, election integrity. We're going to break down the core pillars of the U.S. electoral system: safety, security, and trust, and take on some of the most pressing questions facing American democracy today. How secure are U.S. elections, really? What's fact? What's fiction? And how can you tell the difference? What are officials doing at every level to protect your vote? And how can you help? I'm joined in conversation by Kathy Boockvar, president of Athena Strategies, a nationally recognized leader in election advocacy, election security, and democracy. She's also the former Secretary of State of Pennsylvania and brings a wealth of experience and insight to this conversation. From the impact of misinformation to the behind-the-scenes work that ensures every vote counts, we will be talking about the challenges and the solutions that define integrity of U.S. elections. So whether you are a voter, an election official, or someone who simply cares deeply about protecting democracy, this episode, Securing Democracy at the Ballot Box, is for you. So let's get into it. Hi, Kathy. Thank you very much for joining me today on Let's Talk Democracy. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Tina.
Yeah. So when I asked you to be in this conversation with me, it was because I'd been receiving a lot of comments around elections and probably more around the last two election cycles, when Trump was elected the first time and then when he got reelected the second time. And a lot of folks have been feeling as if their election engagement, I'm going to call that engagement, somehow either has been compromised or isn't valid or has been invalidated. And so I thought, who could I talk to around election safety, security, election integrity? And I thought about you because of the work that you've done in Pennsylvania in particular around this very issue before you were even Secretary of State. And then you really were in it during the first, I think it was the 2016 election cycle.
2020.
2020, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
During the 2020.
At least as Secretary of State, yes.
As Secretary of State. And so I thought, okay, she's been in the shit.
That's a technical term.
Yeah, that's a technical term. Also because I really respect the work that you do around this issue concerning election security, safety, and integrity. So I just thought, let's talk about this. I really would like for you just to talk about elections and security and safety and integrity from your perspective.
Sure. I mean, we have all day, right? I think part of the problems that we have today, and have always had to some degree, is that there's so much that goes into election security and integrity that people just don't know. And so when you have a hole of information, it leads to space where wrong information, false information, whether it's intentional or accidental, can fill it. So I think it might make sense, and I'm happy to break this down in whatever way you want to, but I think it might be useful for me to explain generally how elections work in the U.S. and then where the challenges have been and how we can fill them. So there's a lot of different pieces to the ecosystem. But just starting from the very basics, a lot of people don't realize that elections are completely decentralized in this country. And so I think people have this belief that whether you live in a small town in Alabama or a large city in Minnesota, people think that you have the same rules that apply because of this fundamental nature of we all have a right to vote in this country. But the reality is that what that right to vote looks like is completely different in different states across the country, and even in different counties within a particular state, it can be different. We don't have one, even for a presidential, it's not like we just have one election. It's not even like we have just 50 state elections. We actually have, believe it or not, approximately 9,000 election jurisdictions in the United States. And I will say that again. I'm not exaggerating. We have approximately 9,000 different election officials running local and county elections across the country. And when I say that, what I mean is so in Pennsylvania, ours is at the county level, right? So we've got 67 counties, so we have 67 different elections happening. But in some states, it's at the municipal level. So in Wisconsin, we have 1,900 different election jurisdictions. In Michigan, it's 1,600. In Maine, it's 500. This is where our elections are run, and that's intentional. It was designed that way so that it's really in the community. The people running our elections are our neighbors and our friends. They're people we sit next to in church. They're people who coach our kids on the soccer field. These are the people who are making sure that every one of us can exercise our fundamental right to vote. So the people are at the local level. But then we also have, partnerships with the states and the federal jurisdictions to make sure that the locals have the tools and training and resources in order to run our elections, right? So that's a fundamental thing that a lot of people don't realize. And what that means is that, it as a security issue, that's helpful. Although it's kind of counterintuitive, why would we have 9,000 different jurisdictions? Think of it this way. If you were a bad actor, whether a foreign adversary like Russia, China, or Iran, or a domestic terrorist trying to wreak havoc on a national election in the United States, you would have to learn 9,000 different processes, 9,000 different systems, 9,000 different sets of ballots in order to influence that, which makes it hard to do, right? And so, this is fundamentally what makes our systems of elections strong. So I'm going to pause there because that's just kind of the big picture, but I'm happy to jump into whatever pieces of this you want to talk about next.
I think it's really important that you clarify that because there's this idea that somehow American elections are outside of the control of citizens. And it isn't. I mean, like you said, it's 9,000 different, unique, in many instances, processes for election catered to and for the citizens that it represents. And so then there's a struggle, I think, when you hear in the media, when you hear on social media, that the election process is rigged, that there's no way in which anyone can get a fair shake when they're running for office. We heard that quite often during the first and second term of Donald Trump. He himself said these things, which are untrue. But that is the mantra and the mindset of many voters and people from outside the U.S. who also want to point and not understanding how our systems work. How do you combat that? How do you combat that very important misinformation narrative that people have when you're trying to keep elections open, fair, and free for people?
Yeah, the truth is it takes every one of us. So, I think let's hit this head on, right? First of all, about whether or not elections can be rigged. There have been studies that have looked for decades for the reality of whether elections can and have been rigged. And what they have found is a tiny fraction of a fraction of elections have had circumstances where somebody has been able to commit fraud, whether individual, right? Somebody trying to register in the name of their deceased mother, right? Or vote in the name of their deceased mother, to within a local election, somebody trying to add ballots in that weren't validly cast. So it happens extremely rarely, and usually it can only impact a vote, right? Like the person who I said, there were people in 2020 who, and in every election, to be fair, but like, I don't know if you remember, but in 2020, President Trump encouraged people to test the system, to actually cast. So they did. Like a lot of them were Trump supporters who went in and tried to request mail ballots or cast ballots. There were a handful of them in Pennsylvania. There were handfuls of others in other places, and they got caught and they got prosecuted. There are also a handful of circumstances where you see in a local election, like, for example, for like a town council person, where it's just in a small number of precinct or precincts where there have been workers who have tried to, or candidates who have tried to get folks to commit fraud, right? And there was just an example, I don't know, within the last month of a very local election where that happened. Those have happened, again, rarely, but it's literally impossible to impact a national election or even a statewide election because of the layers that go into it. So I often try to talk about this, and I think, Tina, you and I talked about this. We election officials, we call ourselves nerds, election nerds, because we love the details. We could spend hours talking about all the layers of security and integrity and reconciliation that go into every step of the election process. But of course, most people don't have hours, right? We have to figure out, every one of us have to figure out how to boil this down into conversable facts, right? I've started talking about the people, the science, and the math of elections. And if your listeners walk away with one piece of knowledge that they remember from this podcast, it would be that the people, the science, and the math of elections make our elections strong. So I already talked about the people, right? We talked about the local level there's not like a wizard in a back room or a boss smoking cigars and filling out ballots. That doesn't exist. It's run at the local level. And I didn't even mention, the 9,000 election jurisdictions across the country, that's not even counting the even more local part of our elections, which are the precincts, right? The polling places. In Pennsylvania, for example, we have 9,000 precincts. It's sort of ironic that we have the 9,000 is the same number, but that just happens to be Pennsylvania. We're a large state. We have 9,000 different polling places approximately in the state, in split up among the 67 counties. But so you've got the people who are local folks who are running the elections, right, including poll workers. And by the way, my first job in elections was as a poll worker. That's what sold me on how important our election security integrity was. And I loved it immediately, loved it. Because so I'm going to also have a repeated theme here, which is everyone should volunteer to be a poll worker, because you never feel more like you're part of the wheel of democracy than you do when you're literally helping people vote. And whether you're a denier, like an election denier, if you've got questions, or if you're a total believer in the strength of our democracy, I don't care where you're coming from, it will help you to understand the details of the workings of our democracy. Okay, so back to the people. So we got the people, the science, and the math, right? I kind of covered the people already. So the science of elections, I break down into sort of the hard science and the process science. All right. So hard science over the last 10 years or so. So, many people may recall that following the 2016 elections, it came out that there was evidence that Russia had tried to infiltrate our systems. They had not been successful, but they had tried. And so following the 2016 election, the federal government declared elections as critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security. And what that basically meant was extra attention, support, and resources could be given by the federal government to the state and local governments. And that took a lot of different forms. which were all good. Although as an election official, I could tell you what that did was it made election officials who already were underpaid and overworked just knowing elections, they also then had to become cybersecurity experts. But at least there was lots of support and resources given by the federal government. So lots of hard science strengthened every aspect of our elections, from cybersecurity training to systems, defense systems that went around every part of our computerized systems, to upgraded voting systems. Everything you can imagine in the hard science front is infiltrated, in a good way, is part of our election system. So that's the hard science part. So you were talking about how people have questions about the processes, right? But the processes have been in place and strengthened for decades, right? And so when you think about, say, for example, vote by mail, which is one of those areas that obviously people have raised a lot of questions about whether it's secure. Let me tell you about Pennsylvania and what's involved in voting by mail, okay? So in Pennsylvania, you have to apply to vote by mail in an election. In 2019, our legislature passed a bipartisan bill called Act 77, which gave every voter the right to vote by mail for any reason or no reason at all. We didn't have it before then. Before then, it was you had to have an excuse to vote by mail. But in 2019, there was a bipartisan bill made this open to everybody, long before COVID-19 hit, by the way. But the process for applying hasn't changed. So in Pennsylvania, you have to apply for a ballot. You're checked again. You have to give either your last four of your Social Security number or your driver's license number. You give your address that you're registered at. You're checked against the voter registration database. You're checked against either the driver's license database or the Social Security database. You're validated before you even get a ballot, okay? So then they're sending the ballot to you that you've directed the address that you want it sent to, okay? Then you get the ballot, you open it up, you fill it out, and then you have to put it in an inside envelope, which then goes into an outer envelope. And that outer envelope has a barcode on it, and that barcode is tied to you and solely you. So when you mail the ballot in, the first thing the election office does is scans the barcode, okay? And this is not like a new process. This is a process that's been happening for a long time. They scan the barcode. It's tied to you. If it pops up and you actually applied for the ballot and you're a approved voter, then your ballot's going to be counted. If there's no barcode on the envelope, or if it doesn't attach to a voter that actually applied for and was valid, your vote won't be counted, period. And so in order for somebody to infiltrate that process for that one voter, you need to commit felonies. Right? You either need to get somebody's driver's license or Social Security number. You're signing the envelope saying, I swear that I am this person and that I've applied for this ballot and I haven't voted already in this election. So you're committing a felony under penalty of perjury. Or what, you're going to somebody's mailbox and figuring out exactly when their ballot is going to be delivered to that address, and then you're committing federal mail crimes to steal it out of their mailbox. And in Pennsylvania, this is subject to 7 years in jail and $15,000 fines. Like, this is no joke. So all of those processes are in place to give us security. All right, so that's the science. So you got the people, the science, and last is the math. So I'm going to tell your listeners a really big secret. Elections are all about math. You got, say, in Pennsylvania, 67 counties. Each of them runs their own election. They count the ballots, they canvass the ballots, they allow for all the processes to happen, all the challenges, all the different adjudications that might happen. And then they create a spreadsheet, basically, that has candidate A and candidate B and how many votes each got. They add them all together. They send them up to me or another Secretary of State who adds the districts together, and whoever has the most votes win. So I used to joke that I was mathematician in chief as Secretary of State. So there's the simple math, and we've added in expert math to make sure that the math is right. So we do post-election audits. In Pennsylvania, we actually have 2 post-election audits. We have county by county audits where they audit a random sample of 2,000 ballots or 2% of their voters, whichever is less. And then in 2019, I started a statewide audit called a risk limiting audit, which picks a random sample of ballots across the Commonwealth. And there's a mathematical analysis done that is determined by a roll of the dice. Literally, that's what starts the audit, to develop the calculations of which ballots are going to be pulled from where. And both of those are intended to confirm that the results are correct. And then on top of that, there's reconciliations, literally in every single polling place. So all these math go into making sure that the easy math, right, the columns of how many votes each candidate gets wins. So thanks to the people, the science, and the math, we can all have faith that our elections are secure and that every person that's eligible can cast a ballot securely and have confidence that it's counted accurately.
Yay. That makes me feel good because I believe wholeheartedly in our election system. I'm a 100% voter. I vote every election because I believe in it, and I vote by mail. And that for me is just a privilege to be able to vote by mail. So when it's under attack, I find it very fascinating because I'm like, I do believe that I'm voting by mail since the Civil War. This is a very old process that we have in place, but just to hear how that process works and what goes into it to make sure that it respects and honors the vote that people have put the effort into casting is a relief to me. I'm always amazed at the process and how thoughtful it is because of what it means to each citizen to have the honor to be able to vote in our elections. So what is the biggest challenge for people in understanding what you just laid out very clearly, very succinctly, with a lot of common sense, a lot of care? Why is it that this has become such a lightning rod for people to be willing to blow up a system that is secure and safe and respectful of them?
It's $1 million question, Tina. I remember very well in 2021, obviously the 2020 election, and after I had left the Department of State, I was asked by a foundation to kind of advise them on what I saw as what were some of the critical issues to focus on. And I said back in 2021, disinformation is the critical issue of our time. And I had no idea how far it would go. Even then, I knew it was a critical issue of our time, but it is so much worse than I ever even imagined. We didn't used to talk about it as disinformation. We talked about it as propaganda, right? And it was usually foreign overseas adversaries who were committing it, right? So I remember early on as Secretary of State, or even before I became Secretary of State, but when I was working for the governor in election security, disinformation actually wasn't controversial. There wasn't like a partisan split because there was so much of it was coming from our foreign adversaries that it was seen as a national security issue, which it is, and it was. And so, if you look back to 2016, you were talking about the 2016 election. If you look back to 2016, 2018, there was disinformation, there were conspiracy theories, there were efforts to divide our nation. A lot of it did stem from our foreign adversaries. What started to shift in 2020 was that it got much more taken over by or exacerbated by domestic actors, right? And so you had this very intentional, and COVID-19 did not help. It wasn't all caused by COVID, but the COVID-19, with all the stressors with people dying and with people losing their jobs and businesses and all the shutdowns and nobody having any idea how long this was going to last, the stress of what was already going to be a very tense election, it blew up everything. And so then there was this intentional effort by Trump and his allies and others to fuel that anxiety and tension and to fuel people's distrust in our institutions and our elections and to fuel antagonism, neighbor against neighbor, and pointing a finger at the other. That was even before the election. But post-election, it blew up. Like, it was on a whole different level. So, like, it used to be that if there was something obviously false being pushed out there, and if it was, say, in a publication that was not well respected, it used to be the perception was, don't even bother to respond, because by responding, you're giving it credibility. That all shifted in November of 2020. I remember so well. I was on my way home. I was either on my way to or on my way home from Thanksgiving visiting my daughter. And you may recall that following the 2020 election, Rudy Giuliani did a roadshow, basically a false information about the 2020 election roadshow. And first stop on his roadshow was Pennsylvania. The Republican conference of the state legislature, or I don't know if it was officially in the conference name, but at least some of the Republican leadership in Pennsylvania rented a conference room in a hotel room off of the highway in Gettysburg. Giuliani came. Trump apparently called in. I was not listening, but I had staff who were. And I got a call saying, yeah, it's crazy. They're saying more ballots were cast by mail in the 2020 election, the general, than had been requested. And here's the numbers that they said out loud during this conference. And they took the application numbers from the primary and the casting numbers from the general. Well, pretty much you don't need to be an expert to know that more people vote in general elections than primary elections. And all this was completely public information that were on our website, right? You could see that the first number was on the primary and the second number was from the general. And so the first reaction by folks was, okay, this is crazy and so obviously false, and it's not being put out by a credible source. You don't even need to respond to it. That was the gut. And then we quickly realized that with this, I'm showing my phone, and the 24/7, 365 information ecosystem that is out there at all times, and the platforms that were just became so effective sources of false information, it started to become obvious from that moment forward that you couldn't leave anything unresponded to, because suddenly it was hitting millions and millions of people and they were believing it, even when information was so obvious. And so that's been our biggest challenge over the last 5 years, has been the people who are purveying false information, conspiracy theories, propaganda, tearing down faith in our institutions, tearing down faith in each other. Right? They're doing it very intentionally because it's incredibly effective at getting people to vote your way or not vote. When they're angry and upset, it's much more effective than when they're happy and feeling comfortable. That's just a matter of humanity, right? And it's been very effective. And so our challenge is, how do we beat that back? How do we rebuild faith and trust, and in each other as well as in our institutions? And I'm happy to talk more about that.
I think that is the question, because the challenges that disinformation brings into the election process and the way people engage in it, it's a challenge of who do you believe? It's a challenge of where do you get your information from? It's a challenge of how an elected official, or that, in this case, the Trump administration and their universe, uses disinformation to sow discontent, to undermine our election process, our institutions, and then either folks, as you said, either don't vote or they vote from a space of or a place of being misinformed about what is really happening. And I think one of the things I think about, because I've had conversations with Trump supporters And when I talk to them about why, the things that they tell me do not align with the things that are real. And so that question, and part of the work that I've done in my life is try to have conversations that are challenging, because I don't always agree with the person on the other side of it, but I want to engage in those conversations. When you talk about engaging with community right now, that's very difficult for many people to do, because there's a schism between what some people would call the reality of what's going on and the MAGA reality, or the MAGA unreality of what's going on. And then there's no bridges towards one another to have conversations, to come to a resolution, to share information. So if you have insights, ideas, or thoughts about how we can make bridges towards each other, yes, we have time to talk about that.
Good. I'm not going to pretend that it's anything other than a huge, huge challenge, right? This is not there's no easy solution. So the thing is, because of the integration of our phones and the information superhighway, there's a million different tentacles to the problem. Million is probably too small, right? There's billions of tentacles to the problem, which means that we need to have billions of tentacles to the solution. So I think early on in these conversations, people sort of wanted to know, what's the magic bullet, right? What's the one thing we should be investing in? I was like, there's not one thing. It needs to take a lot of different shapes and pathways. And so the bad news is that's hard. The good news is every one of us can make a difference. And when you look at countries that have been more successful than others and by the way, we didn't even get into AI, right? Like, this is before ChatGPT. A lot of these conversations were happening, but AI has exploded it even further in a bad way. But back to the point, like, if you look at countries where they've been more successful than others in beating back mis and disinformation, it's countries that have a better developed whole of society approach to both combating disinformation and also proactively sharing accurate information. And so countries like Taiwan had an election, I think, at the very beginning of 2024, like January of 2024. And there were examples of AI-generated false information out there. And they still had to deal with it. But if you look at how they've structured, they have a much more advanced than us whole of society approach, where they have libraries and schools and nonprofits organizations. And of course, they also have a public sector that buys into combating disinformation, which we are lacking right now, right? We don't have government at least federal government, that's committed to this. They really integrate the information, make sure that everybody's getting it so that we're reaching people where they are on the ground. And that we don't have. We have not, and granted, like, we are a lot bigger than Taiwan. The United States has a million different communities. But that's where we really have to be building, is making sure that we're reaching people where they are. And that means we have to be in the barber shops. We have to be in the schools. We have to be in the churches. Nurses and firefighters need to be armed with accurate information, because that's who people trust, right? People trust information when they hear it from their firefighter or from their barber. And so if our firefighters and barbers don't have accurate information, then we're screwed. When we were having this conversation early on, and we were talking about, not you and I, but kind of we, the larger world, folks working on this stuff, it's not like you could develop one pager that's going to resonate with all of this. An 80-year-old woman in Iowa needs a different set of talking points than a 20-year-old male from California. Do you remember Schoolhouse Rock?
Yes, I do. I love that show.
Right? We need a 2025 version of this. So Schoolhouse Rock, for those of your listeners that may not know, were these like 5-minute segments of video and music that were interspersed like in between cartoons on Saturday mornings. Maybe there were other times, but I saw them in between Bugs Bunny or whatever else we were watching on Saturday mornings, there would be these little segments that were wonderfully musically and video production of boring things to learn. So everything from science to math to history. All right, Tina, which one pops into your mind? Or grammar. I forgot to say grammar. What do you have any that pop into your head?
Bill is just a bill.
Schoolhouse Rock.
Yes,
And
I remember that.
That was from I want to say it was the 1970s. We'll say that. Okay. So like you, I and millions of us that grew up during that time can sing you word for word parts of the Declaration of Independence, right? Which was like in its own song in a Schoolhouse Rock. They can tell you about processes to the bill. They can tell you what conjunctions are because there was conjunction, junction, what's your function. You can multiply 5, 10, 15 because of things you learned, right? In Schoolhouse Rock. We need to do that in a million different ways about how elections work in this country and how basic government institutions work in this country to stick. They need to be sticky. They need to be short. They need to be things that are going to be said in ways that people can easily understand and remember. And that's not easy. And and there needs to be proactive information like Schoolhouse Rock. We didn't know that the next thing we were going to learn was going to be how the spinal cord gets messages from your brain to your leg, right? Say we need to be proactive in anticipating what people need to know. Like, for example, about vote by mail, how that works, so that people know that, or armed with that information, so that if false information comes their way, they have information to combat it. But we also need to be very quickly reactive. So if false information comes the way of people who haven't gotten a proactive message, that we are immediately nipping in the bud. And that's hard. So there's constantly message testing going on to figure out what the best messages are. But what my message to people is don't wait for the A+ perfectly in a box design. It's never going to happen. We as election officials need to do better, and not just election officials, but we need to give people at least some information that they could message test on their own just by having conversations with their neighbors. And I'll just tell you, just as an example, because this really, really works. I was on a flight a couple of years ago heading to Salt Lake City, Utah. And I never talk to people on airplanes. I always immediately am digging with my nose in the book or, doing work. There was a lovely woman next to me who wanted to chat. And all I knew about her was that she was going home to Salt Lake City. I was going to Salt Lake City for work. So she asked me what I did for work, why I was going to Salt Lake City. And, I told her I was in election security. And, that either makes people move closer or farther away. It's a fascinating conversation to have. So she was a move closer one. And she was like, oh, she's like, what do you do in election security? And then, it came around that I had been Secretary of State of Pennsylvania during the 2020 election. And then she was really interested. And she was like, I've got so many questions. What happened in 2020? Did it happen the way it was supposed to? All these things that you hear. So I told her about the people, the science, and the math. And I told her about all the challenges that have been made across the country in every state, and particularly in the swing states. And I told her about how election officials are some of the heroes of our democracy who work incredibly hard around the clock to make sure every one of us can exercise their right to vote. We talked almost the entire flight. And when we sort of got to the end, she said, and again, I had no idea where she was coming from. I didn't know her politics. I didn't know her religion. I didn't know anything. But we get to the end and she goes, oh, good. She said, I thought so, but I didn't know. And she said, I'm a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And you hear so many things and there's so many people asking questions and saying all this stuff. She said, I don't have the words to talk to people about this. If you could give me the words, I would talk to my friends and my neighbors and my church members and all the people but I need you to give me the words. And I thought, there it is. We need to be giving people the information so that they are armed in the best way to share accurate information with the people in their lives.
In the work that you've been doing around this outside of your role as Secretary of State, where do you see the opportunity? So we talked about civic engagement, right? Like there's civic engagement where you're engaged poll working, you're engaged in the process of elections or running for school board or showing up at school board meetings, community engagement. And then you have the role of the public sector, I'm going to call it, where you have folks who are in charge of sharing information out to the public to engage them in the process. What is needed or what is now in place or available for that information to get out to folks? Or is there still a big gap? And if there's a big gap, how do we fill it so people can get access to it?
Yeah. No, these are all the million dollar questions. So thanks for
We're
asking.
almost rich.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I wish those millions could be invested in the solutions that are necessary. I mean, there are investments being made. I mean, so what I would say is I'm going to go back to the all the tentacles, right? And so people should utilize whatever pathways they're comfortable with, right? There's no one right way to make a difference. So, I mean, some of the right ways that are across the board are what you've already said, right? So I'm going to say it again. Be a poll worker. Encourage everybody you know to be a poll worker. A, because it's hugely needed. B, because it's hugely rewarding. And C, because you will then be even more armed with information to have these conversations. But people sometimes think things like calling your congressperson or your state rep or your state legislator, people think, oh, it doesn't really make a difference. And I am here to say it does. Okay. So, like every one of those calls, even if you never hear back from them, and I know that happens all the time, and I'm sorry on behalf of all those electeds that are not responding to you, but even when you don't hear back from them, I am telling you, they are keeping track literally of every single communication that comes into their office for and against any issue or anything going on. The truth is, there are a lot of us out there who are not happy with how things are going, right? But we tend to be quieter than the others who are looking to tear down our democracy. They are very, very good at showing up to the town halls and to calling their electeds and to writing the op-eds or whatever. We need to be louder. Now, particularly at this moment in time, do not in any way confuse loud with violent. I want to be very clear. We've got awful things happening in LA and around the country. Exercise your right. Go to the protests. Go to the rallies. 100% do that. But do not get violent. We would not have accomplished half of the advances that we made in this country in civil rights and racial justice and all kinds of if we had exercised violence in the streets. I can't say this more clearly. So be loud in terms of speak out and show up. Speak out and show up, whether it's to your elected officials, whether it's to all those protests. I mean, the way that we have ever made change in this country has been by speaking out and showing up. Those are the two biggest things that you can do. And to your point, Tina, like you said, talk to people even when you don't necessarily share a lot in common. Those are some of the best conversations. And I know it's hard because right now, a lot of these conversations are so fired up with tension, so loaded. But having conversations, not just with the people that you know already share your beliefs, but actually with the people you're not sure about and with the people you may know don't share your beliefs, but who may have given you a sign that they're open to hearing other thoughts. There's a lot of people out there who voted for President Trump in November who are not happy with what's going on here. And we need to encourage them that there's a lot of people like them and they need to be able to speak out about it.
I think one of the things that is important when you're going into those kinds of conversations is that you remember that you're not there to convince. If you think about your personal relationship with someone you really love and like and care about, and you're in a heated discussion and you're trying to convince them, we all know we're not convincing anybody because we're stuck, right? Like if you're just in an argument or a harsh or very intense discussion with people, we hold to ourselves what we believe. But when you're in a conversation of trying to understand where the person's coming from, you don't have to agree with where they're coming from, but understand where they're coming from. It really opens up the door for there to be an exchange of ideas. If you walk away with a better understanding of where that person's coming from, and they walk away with a better understanding of where you're coming from, there are seeds that have been planted there that when new information comes into them, they have another layer of filter that they can run it through and go, oh yeah, I had this conversation. And I think that that really is transformative. And I do think that that's a big part of what's missing. And so we have everyone sort of in their corners. But then, like you said, there are a lot of people who are not happy with the way things are going. They voted for Donald Trump, but they're also like, I don't know where to go because it seems like there's not an openness there. I wonder how to create that space for folks to be able to have this conversation. Is it community meetings? Is it people like you going out and kind of having a town hall and talking with people to create that space for people to be able to engage? Because that's something I'm really curious about is how do we start having these conversations that are meaningful and impactful that shift us away from this internal cannibalism that's happening?
Yeah, good word, bad word. Um, yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, my first answer is yes, and. So it's not or. So all the different ways are needed. So one of the things that I've been working on is this sort of 2-level project, which, well, let me actually, even before I talk about that, let me talk about that there are some really interesting models happening for new social media platforms that are community based. And so this is part of this project that I am working on now. But an already created project, example of this is called Front Porch Forum in Vermont. And it's this, I'll call it social media platform, although I'll tell you in a minute how it works, that something like 80% of Vermont households belong to this platform, which, have you ever heard of such a number? 80%.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's incredible. And so it's right now it's only Vermont and a couple of communities adjacent to Vermont. And it's got a very extensive terms of engagement. It doesn't have any of like the algorithms issues. It's community based. So you have to either live in or have a organization or whatever based in a community. And it's not in real time. So when you post on the platform, what you're really doing is you're sending in the thing that you want to post. They've got a whole bunch of moderators who are facilitating the conversation and putting it all together. And then it's kind of like a listserv model where they then send all the comments to all the members the next day. And if you want to respond, you send it in. And again, like the next day, you get the response. So it's not a model that would work everywhere because I think young people in particular probably wouldn't find that 24-hour delay satisfactory. But there's another organization called New Public, which is basically working on creating something in between Front Porch Forum and a Facebook group. And a lot of times people ask me, well, is Nextdoor an example of that? So Nextdoor, I think, was trying to do that, or at least initially was, but it completely failed, right? People complain all the time of like the racism, the nastiness, the antagonism in their Nextdoor groups. So whatever they were trying to do, they did not do it well. So New Public is trying to create an effective example of this. So something that people can use in real time. They're finding local, what they call stewards in the communities. They're going to be piloting in 5 communities by the end of 2025-ish. And then they're hoping to jump it to 50 communities, I think, in 2026, and of course, grow from there. But it's really intended to help facilitate positive, proactive, respectful, and informative, accurate conversations in the community, based in the community. And so I've been working on helping get some of this happening, including as like one layer of how do we reach people where they are, right? Like that's the way to do it, is in the community. In addition to that, one of the projects that I'm working on is helping arm the community-based organizations who each one has their own set of people on the ground who trust them, right? So like the example I always give is like, if you're a new citizen in South Philly, you're not going to know what a Secretary of State is. You're not going to know even there's a city election commissioner, right? But you're going to know the organization that either helped you get citizenship or helped you get housing or support for your family. And so let's say a false robocall targets new Americans in South Philly. It may be this random housing organization that's the only people they could think of who to call. If that housing organization doesn't have access to resources, state or national, the person telling them is not going to be able to get help. But let's say that community-based organization is tied in with a larger effort through infrastructure that we're working on. They may say, upload this robocall and say, the housing organization might upload this robocall and say, hey, this hit South Philly this week. Anybody know anything about it or have any helpful information? And it may be that one of the national partners who's also connected through this infrastructure says, you know what? Same thing happened in Atlanta last week. We developed a bilingual responsive robocall. We can do the same thing for Philly. Here you go, housing organization. Here's the bilingual response. Get this to your people. And then that housing organization has their whole network of people on the ground where they are that they can get it to, that national organization would never even know how to begin to reach. And so it's this, again, I talked earlier about that whole of society approach. It's building that infrastructure. So I'm working on projects to help build that. That's the one layer that then if you have the New Public social media platform that's also based in the community, then you've got the national tied to the local organizations tied to the individuals, and then the individuals tied to themselves. And that's how you start building that whole of society infrastructure.
Something that always strikes me about the whole of society approach is that in order for it to function, especially in a democracy, you need investment. And the biggest source of that investment for citizens should come from our government, right? We do research and development dollars all the time for businesses that go out and become public and then turn around and turn us against each other. So where is the opportunity, or where do you see the funding coming to support such an effort? Because that whole of society approach needs to be supported by the biggest arbiter of our rights, which is the federal government. And under this current Trump administration, that's not going to happen. But is that at the state level, the local level?
So all of the above. I mean, it can be private sector, like philanthropy, right? And there are philanthropy is investing in different ways to try to approach this and other things, right? So just in general, the sort of better infrastructure, stronger infrastructure. But then, yes, absolutely, both local and state governments can and it have invested in different forms of increasing the strength of their communications to citizens. But the problem is that government is already underfunded when it comes to elections and a lot of other things. But when it comes to it's horrifying, right? Because here we are, it's like, literally our nation is built on our fundamental right to vote, and yet we fund it like it's not something that we care about. And so the ball is often left in the hands of the local jurisdictions who have to balance funding elections and communications about elections with housing and roads and a lot of education. They're making tough choices every day. So not all of them can afford having a communications strategy. And of course, in 2020, because of COVID and everything going on, there were private philanthropy did help fill some of this gap so we could get information to voters because they weren't able to go places, right? We had to figure out ways to reach voters with all the shutdowns. But now in many, if not most states, there's these bans on private philanthropy helping fund some of these efforts. So it's a catch-22, and I would just encourage certainly any private philanthropy that can fund these issues, even if it's not through governmental structures because of these restrictions, it can be done through civil society like these other projects that I'm talking about. And it's amazing how much work we can do because it can't be left on the backs of any one official, right? There's no way it will get effectively done. We need to leverage every single one of us.
Yeah, I've had a couple of conversations with some of my guests about philanthropy and how oftentimes they do good work, and I'm using air quotes, but then they also miss the mark, and I'm not using air quotes for that. Because it's the truth, right? Like they missed the mark and the opportunity. And it does seem like one of the opportunities here is to really get in and help fund the on the ground work of communities that know their neighbors, will do this work because they understand the direct benefit from having engagement, having their voices and their votes counted, and really doing that. It's not a heavy lift. I know for funders are like, oh, it's a heavy lift. There's too many small organizations or there's only one person, but that one person is organizing their entire community who will show up for them. Instead of having a larger organization that doesn't participate in that community in a meaningful way, getting dollars and then sort of sharing, sprinkling like a fairy, some of the dust that they've gotten. And I think that's also a big opportunity to help undergird and strengthen the democratic engagement of citizens, is that when folks have access to resources to support their democratic values, they participate in a meaningful way. That's just the reality.
100%. Yeah. And let's both clarify that by democratic, you're talking about democratic with a small d.
Small d.
Right?
Yeah.
But what you said is right on. It's 100% what I agree with we need to do. And so I'll put out a message to any funders that if they're interested in looking for ways to deal with these issues, come talk to me, because this project, because it is community based for what we're trying to reach, but also is building the layers of infrastructure to connect all the different levels of community to individual community, state, national folks. Like this can scale. And so every investment, like you can't start out and think you're going to fund the entire country all at once and suddenly we have this infrastructure. So we're starting in communities like Milwaukee, in places where you can create and tinker with this community's model and then learn for the next one. And they're all going to be slightly different, and they're going to be designed by the community. So the stewards in that community are going to help shape what works there and what works, kind of much like voters and election officials in the decentralization of elections. How people most effectively communicate in Milwaukee is going to be different than in Nashville and different than a tiny town in the middle of Iowa. As an investor, you can choose the communities you want to start building. I'm happy to help facilitate those conversations. And it's one of the things I love about it, Tina, is that obviously we're spending a lot of necessary time right now. And I'm like, every dollar needs to be spent on this too, but we're spending a lot of time focusing on either averting disaster or filling gaps that are being left or preventing disaster or resolving problems. This is completely proactive. This project that I'm talking about is completely proactive and positive. It is building from the community up, from the individual up. And I think it is essential for moving forward and beating back this 24/7, 365 super information highway that people are getting all their information on their phones.
Here, here. I want to ask you a question that I have been hearing a lot about, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit. And it's actually more commentary than this question. And I've heard people say there's not going to be any more elections in the US to worry about. And I laughed. I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny. So it's like a nervous laugh. I wanted to know your thoughts about that.
I shouldn't laugh either, but if we didn't laugh, we would cry,
We
right?
would cry.
And whether you're laughing or crying as a listener here, whatever you do, don't crawl out under the bed. Whether it's laughing or crying that motivates you, get out on the streets and exercise your voice. So what I would say is this. I talked about the people, the science, and the math of elections, right? And so there are just a tremendous number of guardrails in place. Because elections are run at the local and state levels, there are state laws determine how elections are run. There are local and state officials that run the elections that have all those processes, the process science that I talked about. I gave one example with the vote by mail, but every step of the process has very strict rules in place that election officials need to follow. So it's not like you can just have a president of the United States who snaps his fingers and says there'll be no 2026 election. Like, that's not how it works. And we're seeing there's all these efforts at executive orders. Actually, there was a win in one of the cases challenging the president's executive order on elections that was issued a couple of months ago. I talked about the election officials, right, and all the rules and regulations that govern elections, but there's also the courts that are an essential part of making sure that things happen as they should. And we're seeing every day the courts are doing just that, just like they did in 2020. I have to say, in 2020, every lawsuit was filed that they could, it was like they threw a piece of spaghetti at the wall and whatever stuck, they just would file these cases. And some of the quotes by the judges, who, by the way, at least in Pennsylvania, were mostly lifelong Republican judges, many of whom were Trump appointee federal courts, again and again and again found that the parties and the lawyers had not provided facts or law to support any of the spaghetti that they threw against the wall. Same thing we're seeing now. Now, there's still a long way to go between now and 2026. But I have a lot of faith in the courts and in the election officials for making sure that things happen as they should. And it has happened as it should every election. Having said that, I am pretty sure that there will be efforts to interfere with the ability of elections, at least to be certified as they normally should be in 2026, just like there were a lot efforts in 2020 to prevent the certification of the elections. I'm quite sure we will see that again. I think some of these executive orders that we've seen are very specifically trying to lay the groundwork to allow for such challenges to happen. So don't be surprised if we see the efforts. I do have a lot of faith in our judiciary and our election officials, and the faith and trust of the American people are going to be essential in that. And so the whole see something, say something, call it out. If there's efforts to do stuff that is clear, I mean, look, so much of this stuff is anti-American. It's against the very foundations that this nation was founded. Say that, talk about it. You don't have to even point names. You can just say, look at what's going on in LA, right? our National Guard and our Marines and our heroes. They are there to help defend us against foreign threats. Talk to people about the fact that the last time that military was sent in to a state against the wishes of the governor were 60 plus years ago. It was in Alabama when we had peaceful demonstrations by people who were trying to move
Exercise
civil
their
rights.
their right to vote.
Exactly. Goes back to the speak up and speak out, show up. Like two most important things we could leave people with here today.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because I do think at the end of the day, it's yes, all these things are possible. And the other side of this is possible. Beating this back and organizing and engaging and having, I say this in every episode, just about having the people's voice be the resounding voice, a reason, because at the end of the day, democracy only exists because we, the people, exist in the democracy. Without us, there's no democracy. That confirmation, that reaffirming of what it means for our systems to work. It is the judiciary doing their part, but it's the people saying, we know this is not the way it's supposed to be. And so we are putting ourselves out there, making our voices heard. And so I think those are the things that are, all of those things move us towards making sure that we have safe, secure elections full of integrity. And unfortunately, at this point in time in our history, we have to fight for it. It's never been a guarantee either, but we really have to fight for it.
You brilliantly said. Oh, I think it's a really good way to end is with that message, which is, look, the reality is we have lived through, I know this feels like a really, really hard time, and it is, but we have lived through harder things. We have lived through 2 world wars and the Civil War and the Great Depression and the Civil Rights Movement, and people died for their right to vote. And I am not at all pretending that any of it was easy. It took years, it took decades, it took generations, right? But the one thing that they all have in common is they took people, they took our citizens expressing themselves, taking to the streets peacefully, and speaking out and saying, this is not who we are. So I am fully confident that we will emerge from this as well, but it will take every one of us. And that's both a burden and an opportunity. So make it an opportunity.
Thank you very much for that, Kathy. I really enjoyed having you on today.
It was great. Great to be on. Great conversation. Thanks, Tina.
Today's episode was really insightful. We explored the essential components that keep U.S. elections safe, secure, and trustworthy. From the safeguards built into the system to the work being done by election officials at every single level. A huge thank you to Kathy for sharing her deep expertise and practical insights on how we can all play a part in defending democracy, whether by recognizing and rejecting misinformation, supporting transparent election processes, or simply staying informed and engaged. As we learned today, election integrity isn't just a government responsibility, it is a collective one. Every voice matters. Every vote counts. And the more we understand the system, the better we can protect it. And as I like to say, democracy is not a spectator sport. Click on the link in today's episode's description box that will provide you with resources and tools to help ensure safe, secure, and trustworthy elections. If you found this conversation helpful, be sure to subscribe, share, leave a review. And as usual, feel free to send me an email with feedback, comments, or questions to tina@patternchangelab.com. Join me next week when I will be wrapping up Season 1 of Let's Talk Democracy with insights, reflections, and a sneak peek at what's to come in Season 2. Talk with you then.